Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings and welcome to the inaugural Renee Crown Honors Symposium. I am Danielle Smith, the director of the Renee Crown University Honors Program. To begin, I acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I am truly so excited to see longtime supporters of the honors program and to meet new friends and colleagues. Today is special for us. It commemorates the first Renee Crown Honors Symposium, and we are so proud to host it in this beautiful auditorium in Slocum Hall. I thank Renee and Lester Crown for their generous gift to establish the Crown Honors Endowed Fellow Professorships, which demonstrates their commitment to the ideal that an honors education does have the power to transform lives, communities, and societies. This symposium is hosted by Professor Heidi Henley, Associate Professor, Biology, the inaugural Renee Crown Honors Professor in the Sciences and Mathematics, and Professor Karen Nissenbaum, Assistant Professor Philosophy, the inaugural Renee Crown Honors Professor in the Humanities. The symposium panelists are Angela Breitenbach, a philosopher who teaches at Cambridge University and who has written on the beauty of scientific theories and relationships between beauty and truth. And Suzanne Ankers, a contemporary visual artist and theorist, and a bioart pioneer based in New York City. And my new friend. As endowed Crown professors, Heidi and Karen work to enhance the honors intellectual space. In this symposium, scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds will bring their experiences together to discuss their research on the inaugural theme of the value of beauty, with particular attention to beauty in the natural sciences. To end, I thank Interim Dean Agnew of the College of Arts and Sciences, Provost Ritter, and Chancellor Silverwood for their support of the Crown Fellows. I thank Professors Henley and Nissenbaum for their enrichment of the academic and campus life for honors and for all students. I thank Suzanne Ankers and Angela Breitenbach for traveling from both near and far to share their interdisciplinary research with us. To our colleagues, we will continue to inform you of future initiatives of the fellows and hope that again you can join us for these special events. Welcome and thank you so much. Karen.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to thank Danielle and Ali and Maya, who is in the back there, for making all of this possible. Without their help, we wouldn't be here. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Angela Breitenbach, who is Professor of Philosophy in the Faculty of Philosophy at Cambridge University and a Fellow in King's College. Her research focuses on Kant and modern philosophy, and specifically on themes in aesthetics, philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and environmental philosophy. In previous publications, one of the main questions that she has addressed concerns the relationship between aesthetic judgments and judgments of cognitive judgments of knowledge and truth. And in her current research project, Ideals of Unity, Breitenbach explores the nature and value of the ideal of unity for scientific research and more generally for understanding the phenomena that surround us. She's published numerous articles in different journals on these topics and edited 3 volumes. And I very much look forward to the discussion.
I don't think I need that. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to Karin and Heidi for inviting me to Syracuse. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm excited about being part of the symposium with Suzanne Anker. I'll speak about beauty, science, and imagination. And I want to start with just acknowledging that I think beauty is a value that is central to our lives. It's central to various aspects of our lives. I think maybe most importantly, it plays an important role in sort of contemplative enjoyment. We take pleasure in beauty when we appreciate a beautiful piece of music or nature or a painting. The value of beauty is also, I think, associated with community building. So we come together over a shared understanding about a beautiful object or maybe beautiful practices. The value of beauty, I think, also has something to do with conservation. So we put a lot of effort and money into conserving what is beautiful, both in art and in nature. So there are various aspects of our lives where beauty is a value to us. What I want to argue in this talk is that beauty also has value in our cognitive lives. So that's something I want to say more about. Beauty, I think, is an important value in our cognitive lives. I'm going to argue for that by thinking through the idea that there's a common element in our appreciation of beauty, in our experiences of beauty, on the one hand, and also in our coming to understand the world. So my suggestion is that what underlies experiences of beauty and achievements of understanding is a shared imaginative engagement with the objects that we appreciate or understand. So my program for the talk is this. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the relationship between beauty and imagination. So I focus here on imagination as it contributes to experiences of beauty. And what I want to suggest is that many experiences of beauty rely on the experience's imaginative engagement with the object that they appreciate. And I'm going to argue that this is the case both in experiences of beauty in art and in science. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to move on, I'm still here. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to move on to the relationship between imagination and understanding. What I want to suggest there is that the same sorts of imaginative activity that underlie experiences of beauty also play a role in our coming to understand the phenomena. And in the final part, I'll say something about the implications of this idea that there's a common core to experiences of beauty and to understanding. And I'll say a few words about what these implications are and perhaps what objections might be raised. I want to think a little bit about the possible problems. Okay, so moving on to part one. The suggestion I want to start with is that many experiences of beauty rely on the experience's imaginative engagement with the beautiful object. And I want to start by thinking about an example from the performing arts. So it's already a few years ago that I saw this beautiful dance performance by Pina Bausch. Pina Bausch is a German choreographer who died in 2009. She was very influential on modern dance, in particular on a type of dance called dance theater, a dance that incorporates many sort of expressive and dramatic elements. And the show I saw called Vollmond or Full Moon is one that has left a lasting impression on me. I want to show you a short clip from the dance to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So. Okay, so whenever I see this, I want to see more. Sorry, but I'll leave it there. Just want to change to a different image. What I want to suggest, I'll come to this image in a moment. What I want to suggest about the dance is that what I think made the dance so beautiful when I watched it was how was the way in which the apparently simple movements on stage intimated something that I at least found recognizable, that perhaps is universal about human experience and human emotions. In this case, about desire, about the ecstasies and cruelties of courtship. So there's a lot of dance between couples in the show. And also about the fine line between humor and despair. So there are many sort of images and scenes that are very humorous, but close to feelings of despair on the part of the portrayed characters. The beauty of the dance had to do with how a series of very ordinary movements on a relatively minimally decorated stage hinted at insights that were about something so complex and often so incoherent as human emotions and human experience. So what I want to suggest is that the beauty of the dance had to do with the way in which the movements on stage and the scenes and the sounds that the audience experienced embodied ideas that were of significance to us, to the audience members, including about ideas of romantic relationships and so on. But this creative achievement on the part of the show, on the part of Bausch's Vollmond, was not just that of sort of enunciating a determinate meaning, and my experience of the show wasn't just the experience of deciphering a fixed code or sort of getting a clear set of statements. Rather, the experience was one that required a creative involvement on the part of the audience, on the part of me, in engaging with what I saw and what I heard. It prompted what I would describe as a sort of open-ended task on the part of the audience member, a task to be performed by me, by other audience members, of engaging with the ideas that we found embodied by the show, of drawing out meaning that was, at least to some extent, left underdetermined by the show. And so what I would describe my experience as was, I sort of felt as if I was challenged to think further. The show challenged me to go beyond what it strictly showed, and to try out a variety of interpretations to make sense of the images and sounds that I experienced. And I think that this experience generalizes to experiences of other artworks beyond dance performances, where when we experience the beauty of the artwork, our appreciation often relies on our own imaginative engagement with the work. We experience the beauty of an artwork when it sort of seizes our attention and makes us engage with the work by means of the imagination, going beyond what is strictly shown, what we can strictly see or hear or touch or maybe smell in some cases. So the imaginative reflection on the part of the audience, and this is where I get to the audience. There's a small audience here. In this case, the audience actually includes the choreographer. This is Pina Bausch, which is fine because I think the choreographer herself can be an audience member, sort of appreciate what she is creating. from the perspective of the audience, taking a sort of reflection on her work. But what I want to suggest is that the audience plays a crucial role in the creation of the beautiful object. And to linger a bit on this idea of the imaginative engagement with the object, I think it can take different forms. For instance, an artwork may prompt me to imaginatively explore certain associations that can be connected with the artwork. I may take the show to present ideas of the central but complicated role of desire in human relationships. For instance, the work of Vollmond may lead me to contemplate the playful duets that are included in the show as either games of playful seduction or perhaps more dangerous, coercive encounters. And there, my imagination has some freedom to see what it can make out of what I perceive. The show may also prompt me to imagine what the characters of the duets are going through, what emotions they are feeling, what their story is, and it may thereby put me into a position of feeling different being in different emotional states. I may be sort of tense with suspense or just curious how the scene unfolds, maybe agitated, and so on. An artwork may also encourage me to imaginatively elaborate on what I take to be expressed by the work. So for instance, I may picture the couple's background story, the way they came to meet, or the obstacles they had to overcome in order to be together. I may envision two budding lovers that are excited about getting to know each other, perhaps hesitant about succeeding at their attempts at seduction. Or I might picture a well-rehearsed couple of many years, nervously but decidedly aiming to rekindle their passion for one another. Again, I want to say this is all the work that the audience is doing with the help of their imagination, and there's some freedom to their imaginative engagement with the work. So these various imaginative activities exemplify the contribution of the imagination at the heart of the experience of beauty that I've described here. Here I'm acknowledging Noel Carroll's terms when he describes the audience as co-creating the artwork or the aesthetic object, the object that we're appreciating as beautiful. The beautiful performance is created not only by the choreographer and her dancers, but also by the audience members who are imaginatively engaging with what they perceive. And this parallels an important idea that I find in Kant. So it's a Kantian idea that aesthetic pleasure arises from the imaginative reflection on the part of the experiencer. I'm not going to go into the details of Kant's theory, but I'll just put this idea here on the slide. Kant argued that such reflection, such imaginative reflection, consists in the free play of the powers of representation. The powers of representation, our faculties, in particular, he was thinking of imagination and understanding. And on Kant's account, this free play consists in a sort of play between imagination and understanding. Imagination suggesting certain representations which are suited to understanding but aren't really tied down by any particular interpretation of the understanding, that get us to be in a sort of state of appreciation, an open-ended reflection that involves imagination and understanding. And if we think of this in the context of Pina Bausch's show, we might say that my imaginative reflections on the show are suitable in the sense that the ideas that are suggested to me by my imaginative engagement with the show are ideas that I can make sense of, that are sort of perhaps furthering my understanding, but that aren't tied down by any particular determinate interpretation of the show. They are free. My faculties are in free play. This is the Kantian idea. And I want to suggest that this imaginative engagement on the part of the audience in our experiences of beauty and art also plays a role in science. So this is where I want to move on to an example from the history of science. But perhaps just to raise an objection to myself, I guess it's not obvious that there is this parallel between art and science. We might think that art is importantly different from science because it doesn't just suggest ideas, it doesn't just sort of present us with ideas that we're then asked to reflect on. It's meant to give us a determinate explanation of the data. And it's meant to do that, at least if it's somewhat successful as a scientific theory or a scientific explanation or proof. And so we might think that the imagination just doesn't have the same sort of freedom in science, in reflecting on science, as it does in the case of art. But what I want to suggest is that the contrast isn't quite as stark as I've just drawn it. There is room for imagination also in science, and I'm going to say a bit more about what I take that role to be in a moment. So what I want to do now is compare my experience of Pina Bausch's show with an experience that Werner Heisenberg, pioneer of quantum mechanics, described an experience that he himself had when he was in the process of formulating his own theory. So Heisenberg is one of the most important physicists of the 20th century. He's also a somewhat difficult figure for his involvement in the nuclear weapons program in Nazi Germany. So there's a lot more I would like to say about him, but I'll keep it short here. The reason why I chose a passage from an article of his in which he describes this aesthetic experience is that unlike many other scientists, he doesn't just use aesthetic terminology to describe his work. So he doesn't just say, he doesn't just talk about the beauty of his theory or the elegance of a proof, but he actually describes the experience he had in formulating the theory. And I think this is something that you don't often find in scientists reflecting on their work. So I want to read out a passage from an article by Heisenberg. It's a passage that he wrote in 1925. This is a picture of the island of Helgoland, where he had the experience. So he went to this island, as the story goes, after several weeks of intensely working on the theory of quantum mechanics that he was in the process of formulating. And he was in discussions with his mentor, Niels Bohr, in Copenhagen. They had a lot of arguments about the right way of formulating the ideas. Apparently, Heisenberg suffered from hay fever, and he went to the island because it has no trees. It's quite bare island. He retreated to the island, and that's where he apparently had this experience of sort of seeing the structure of the quantum structure of the phenomena of matter. So let me read out the quote to you. When the first, I should perhaps say one thing before I read it. Heisenberg talks here about the energy principle. This is the principle that he's famous for, the uncertainty principle, as it's usually referred to, which states that for any two variables, so for instance, variables of a particle, its position and its momentum, if we give a precise definition of the first or a precise description of the first, the more imprecise our description of the second is. So the uncertainty or energy principle, as Heisenberg states it here, is that principle. This is what he's famous for. This is the principle that he's in the process of proving and of clarifying to himself. So let me read out the passage. When the first terms, mathematical terms, seemed to accord with the energy principle, he says, I became rather excited, and I began to make countless arithmetical errors. As a result, it was almost 3 o'clock in the morning before the final results of my computations lay before me. The energy principle had held for all the terms, and I could no longer doubt the mathematical consistency and coherence of the kind of quantum mechanics to which my calculations pointed. At first, I was deeply alarmed. I had the feeling that through the surface of atomic phenomena, I was looking at a strangely beautiful interior, and I felt almost giddy at the thought that I now had to prove this wealth of mathematical structure nature had so generously spread out before me. I was far too excited to sleep. And he ends by saying that what I saw during that night in Helgoland was admittedly not very much more than the sunlit rock edge I had glimpsed in the autumn of 1924. So he's writing this in 1925. He's suggesting at the end that he actually hasn't seen much more than what he had already understood in the autumn previously. But he sort of saw the sunlit rock edge, not the full light, but he saw a glimpse of what his theory might entail. So I take Heisenberg to be describing an aesthetic experience here. His descriptions suggest that in the process of carrying out a range of mathematical calculations, he felt a genuine aesthetic pleasure. But he didn't just sort of take pleasure in particular properties of the theory that he's in the process of formulating, nor did he, it seems, just take pleasure in the fact that his calculations were correct, that they fit the proposed principle. But I think what he's describing is the experience of how his sort of developing infant theory suggested to him insights into the structure of the atomic phenomena, but only suggested them to him. So as Heisenberg puts it, by going through his computations, he felt as if he could see into a strangely beautiful interior. But so far, it's only a suggestion. It's just a glimpse of what his theory might entail. And so what I think is going on is that Heisenberg's experience of the beauty of his theory arose from the theory's achievement of intimating to him ideas that he hadn't yet fully grasped and that he needed to spell out and prove, but that sort of gave him a glimpse. And I want to suggest that this glimpse, this idea that is suggested by the theory, is something that was only available to Heisenberg through his use of imagination. He could only go beyond beyond the insights that were strictly speaking offered by his calculations with the help of imagination. And so that this intimation of a strangely beautiful interior of the phenomena and of a mathematical structure that was yet to be proven, therefore centrally relied on Heisenberg's use of imagination. More generally, just as an art, I therefore want to suggest that this example illustrates that the kind of aesthetic experience that we are more familiar with, perhaps in art, can also be found in science, and seems to rely on the same sort of involvement of our own imaginative engagement with the object of appreciation, with the scientific theory or the scientific proof. And we might, again, say more about what that involves. It may involve different kinds of imaginative activity, not just the one that Heisenberg describes. It might involve my imaginatively exploring ideas that are suggested by a theory, by reflecting on ways in which the theory accounts for particular phenomena. Or it might involve me imagining the plethora of particular situations for which the theory holds true. A theory may also force on me the activity of imaginatively elaborating on how the theory fits in with our wider conception of the natural world. It may sort of suggest to me ways in which what I am in the process of working out or understanding fits in with other scientific discoveries, other scientific truths I take to be important. And so what I want to suggest is that just as in art, these various activities of imagination contribute to experiences of beauty in science. And if this is right, then there's a common element to Heisenberg's aesthetic appreciation of his infant theory of quantum mechanics and my experience of Pina Bausch's show. It lies in the pleasure that arises from the creative achievement of the representation, the theory in one case, the show in the other case, to point me to important ideas where this pointing to relies on my own imaginative engagement with the representation. And so this awareness of the achievement, I want to say, relies on the imaginative reflection on the part of the audience, or on the part of the scientist or science student. Okay, that's the first part. I want to move on to my second suggestion. The same kind of imaginative engagement with the object also contributes to understanding. Before I go into this second claim, let me just highlight one assumption that I'm making here, and that's an assumption about what I mean by understanding. There's a huge philosophical literature on this question. I just want to say one thing which I think is relatively intuitive, and that is that understanding has something to do with unification, with unifying different ideas, either under a general principle or in a common framework. So, for instance, I might understand more when I see that a variety of optic phenomena, including rainbows, are the effect of the effect of sunlight as it's reflected in droplets of rain. Or I might understand more when I see how the physics of optics accounts for these phenomena, how it sort of accounts for a variety of different phenomena. So what I want to suggest is just that understanding involves this sort of unifying of a variety of phenomena or ideas under a general principle or a unifying framework. And that's important to make sense of what I want to say next. So against the background of this understanding of understanding, I want to suggest that the imaginative activities that are involved in my experiences of beauty also contribute to my coming to understand the phenomena. So again, let me think about the two cases of science and art. I want to start with science in this case. Perhaps most obviously, imagination contributes to the process of discovery in science. So in reflecting on the phenomena that we seek to explain, we may imaginatively explore ideas that unify the phenomena, and we may go through in our imagination the implications of such ideas for the phenomena that we haven't yet studied, further possible phenomena. For that, we don't need to go and do the experiments, but we might start with imagining them. For instance, in going through his calculations, Heisenberg may have imaginatively filled in the insights to which his calculations pointed him. And so by imaginatively exploring the suggested ideas of the quantum structure of the phenomena, he came to see the inner structure that unify a vast variety of atomic phenomena. Here's an illustration of some of these implications of his ideas. So according to Heisenberg's quantum mechanics, we cannot predict the exact location of a particle in space, but we can give the probability of the location of an electron in an atom. Here, this is a representation of the probability of the position of electrons in hydrogen atoms, and the brighter areas are meant to represent the more likely location. So what I want to suggest is that this seeing the structure of atomic phenomena involves the imagination, and involves the imagination in a way that led Heisenberg to gain understanding. It was involved in the sort of process of discovering a new idea for explaining the quantum structure of matter. Perhaps less obvious, imagination, I think, is also involved in developing, testing, and selecting theories. So consider, for instance, the development of new theories, which is usually a gradual and drawn-out process. Here, even once a new theory has been proposed, it's not immediately clear how it relates to the phenomena. There's often what philosophers of science have called a certain looseness of fit between the theory and the phenomena, so more work is required to spell out which phenomena a theory can explain or what it can predict about the phenomena. And in these contexts too, I take imagination to play an important role in, for instance, representing to us possible situations for which the theory holds, which the theory can predict. And here again, in imaginatively spelling out different situations, perhaps also representing to us individual phenomena that represent abstract concepts that are employed in the theory. Imagination is crucial for developing our understanding, of advancing the theory, understanding the theory better, and thereby also giving it credibility, seeing how it might be preferred over other alternative theories. Furthermore, testing a theory and selecting it from among possible alternatives requires the imagination insofar as it may prompt us to imaginatively elaborate on particular situations that instantiate the theory and to examine them in relation to other theoretical principles that we may hold true. And here, this imaginative activity is a further part of our ability to achieve and deepen understanding, because in elaborating on the theory's fit with other scientific theories and other scientific insights, it brings about a form of unification. It sort of advances our understanding of how different natural phenomena fit into a coherent theoretical system. So as these considerations show, I think there's again an unexpected connection between experiences of beauty in science and the scientist's aim of understanding, where the same kind of imaginative activities that lie at the basis of our experiences of beauty also contribute to the often creative process of generating new theories, developing them, and defending them against possible alternatives. And I take this to be another facet of a Kantian idea, so I just want to highlight this. The unifying and synthesizing activities of imagination on Kant's account too are involved not just in our experiences of beauty, but also in our cognitive activities. Here's one quote from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason a little bit earlier, from the Critique of Judgment that I mentioned before, where Kant argues that imagination is required to make an abstract concept sensible, since without this, the concept would remain, as one says, without sense. So the imagination is important on Kant's account, not just for sort of generating aesthetic experiences, but also for getting us to see what an abstract concept might mean, what its content might be, and how it relates to experiences that have to do with what is given to us in the senses, experiences of empirical matters of fact. So with Kant, I want to suggest that the imagination has this dual role in experiences of the beautiful and cognitive achievements. And again, I think that the same connection between imagination and understanding also characterizes our engagement with art. So consider again the aesthetic experience that I enjoyed when seeing Bausch's beautiful show Vollmond. As I suggested, my experience of the show was grounded in my imaginative engagement with the work, and this engagement may, for instance, consist in my imaginatively exploring ideas about the role of desire in human relationships that I played out in the various duets in the show. Here's another image of some of these portrayals of interactions between couples. This is actually from a different show, but it's a sort of common theme in Bausch's performances. What I want to suggest is that when I am sort of fictively imagining details about the characters in these duets, what emotions they are going through, how these emotions were expressed, and so on, I may actually come to understand something I didn't understand before. I may come to understand something, for instance, about the role of desire in human relationships. I may come to see that that desire may take different functions in relationships. It may be playful, aggressive, romantic. It may be unsettling or perhaps balancing, maybe destructive to certain relationships. And what I want to suggest is that this imaginative engagement with the work can crystallize and unify existing conceptions. And it can make me thereby become aware of certain forms of desire and their role in human relationships that I hadn't previously recognized as such, as forms of desire. And in these ways, imagination can advance my understanding of the concept. And there are other ways in which imagination, I think, is involved in helping us come to understand through our engagement with art. For instance, my aesthetic experience of Vollmond may also have been informed by my imaginatively constructing a narrative whole out of the ideas that I take to be expressed by the performance. For instance, I might think of Bausch's dance as unified by the idea of solitude and how it relates to the desire for love. I may, in combining in imagination different components of the performance under this overarching theme, I may see deeper connections that I previously hadn't recognized. I may discover, for instance, a common thread and common patterns in human experience that unify what at first appears complex and often incoherent, but that sort of through my engagement with what is shown on stage might make me see that these different, complex, perhaps incoherent parts of human experience are actually part of a unifying whole, part of what we might describe as the role of desire in human relationships, for instance. So what I take that to suggest is that in engaging imaginatively with art as with science, we can gain the kind of unification that is required for understanding, either understanding ideas that are suggested by theories or ideas that are suggested by artworks, such as dance performances. And that may help us gain a better understanding of the world. Okay, so that was the second part of my talk. I want to get to the final point, the overarching idea that beauty is an important value in our cognitive lives. And it's an important value in our cognitive lives because there is this common element of imagination in experiences of beauty and instances of understanding. So I think this has, if this is right, if there is this common element, this has important implications for our understanding of the value of beauty and our understanding of its role in art and science. So I want to say a few last words about that. One implication, I think, is that art can have cognitive import. So we can learn something from our engagement with art. And this cognitive import of art isn't sort of an independent value, independent from our aesthetic appreciation of art, but is actually tied to our aesthetic appreciation because it's grounded in the same imaginative engagement with the work. So what I want to suggest is that when we learn something through our engagement with artworks, that cognitive learning is not an independent value, but is a value that is tied to the value of beauty. That's one implication for thinking about art. I think there's also an implication for thinking about science, which is that that beauty has a role in science, that we can have genuinely aesthetic experience of science, and that these genuinely aesthetic experiences aren't independent or entirely divorced from the cognitive role of our engagement with science. And again, that's because of this common core, because of it's grounded in the same imaginative engagement with scientific objects like theories and proofs. So what I want to suggest is that the beauty of science has scientific relevance because it is grounded in the same activities of imagination that also contribute to the understanding we gain through science. And there's then an intrinsic connection between the search for beauty and that for understanding. To seek beauty is to seek understanding in the sense that both are grounded in the same activities of imagination. Now, before I end, I want to engage an objection, or perhaps a set of two related objections to that suggestion. And that is perhaps the sort of worry that if what I suggest is right, it would look as if all experiences of beauty should also lead to understanding, and that's clearly not right. So what do I say about the worry that not all experiences of beauty lead to understanding? And then the sort of opposite worry that not all achievements of understanding are beautiful. Isn't this something that jars with the suggestion I've just made? I just want to think a little bit about this set of worry. So on the first point, if, as I've argued, the same imaginative activities that ground experiences of beauty also make understanding possible, then it would seem that all aesthetic experiences should lead us to understanding, but not all do. We often can and do appreciate art for its own sake, without further cognitive interests or benefits. And we sometimes can and do appreciate the beauty of false theories or false and long discarded proofs, which don't fit with any other theories we hold true today and that we take to be important today. So that's the first worry. On the second point, not all achievements of understanding are aesthetically pleasing. We might think of, I don't know, certain proofs we had to learn, either as science students or at school, that were arduous, that were very hard to understand, where the understanding we gained through them was hard-earned, but wasn't, we didn't go through a pleasurable experience. So what I want to look at is the worry that not all achievements of understanding really do lead to such experiences of beauty. Is that a problem for my proposal? I want to say that in response to this, I think that our aesthetic and cognitive lives have imagination as their common core, but only as their common core. So what I want to suggest is that this common core by itself, so the imaginative engagement by itself, is not sufficient either for understanding or for the experience of beauty, but it may lead us quite far. So what I want to suggest is that with regard to the first worry, we may be engaged in explorative or elaborative imaginings. We may explore ideas that are associated with Bausch stance, and we may elaborate on their meaning, but we may not settle for any particular idea or draw a determinate learning out of our engagement there. We may just sort of take pleasure in the contemplation. And if we don't come to any conclusions, then we also don't sort of advance our understanding. And that's possible on my account. It's just that sort of the learning or the understanding would require a kind of cognitive commitment to a conclusion we draw from our engagement with the work. It would require an extra step to go. In the case of achievements of understanding that aren't beautiful, what I want to suggest there is that that often happens, and it happens not because there isn't the joint or common core of imaginative engagement that unifies aesthetic experiences and achievements of understanding, but rather because taking pleasure in our engagement with an artwork, again, also requires a certain availability of the mind to linger and to not be rushed to a conclusion. So again, I want to suggest that the imaginative engagement on its own perhaps isn't enough, but rather it requires a further openness, perhaps enough time, being in the right frame of mind in order to enjoy what we're doing. And sometimes we just are pressed for time, or perhaps we have too much trouble understanding the science to be able to engage, to take pleasure in the aesthetic experience that comes along with our imaginative engagement with the work. So what I want to suggest is that the common core I've talked about is only a common core, but it does lead us a good way to both aesthetic experiences and understanding. So despite a certain looseness of the connection between the value of beauty and our cognitive lives, I want to conclude that many experiences of beauty and many achievements of understanding are unified by the same activities of imagination, and that it's for this reason that beauty has an important place in our cognitive lives as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your attention.
So we'll have a 10-minute break.
Or we'll go ahead.
We'll go ahead. Okay, so let's go ahead with the second.
All right. So thank you for our first speaker. I'm super excited to introduce to you Suzanne Anker. One thing I do want to say is after this, we'll have a short panel discussion where you guys can ask questions to both of our speakers, and the speakers can ask questions to each other. And then we have a reception afterwards too, so please make sure you come to that over at the Art Museum. All right, so Suzanne, I'm delighted to have her here. She is a bioart pioneer. I think Danielle stole my line early on. She's a visual artist and theorist working at the intersection of art and the biological sciences. So if any of you know me, I'm a scientist, but I have so much appreciation for her being at this intersection. Her practice investigates the ways in which nature is being altered in the 21st century, and she has deep interests in genetics, climate change, and species extinction, where she calls attention to the beauty of life, a topic that I'm excited to hear her discuss today. I had the opportunity of meeting Suzanne back in 2019 and viewing her exhibition at the Everson Museum of Art entitled 1.5 degrees Celsius. Maybe some of you guys got to see that. That references the projected increase in temperature between 2030 and 2052 due to global warming. Through this exhibit, Suzanne created a platform for discussion about the ways humans have altered nature in the past and will be required to alter nature in the 21st century. Of course, this is only one of the many important and thought-provoking exhibitions that Suzanne has had during her career. In addition, Suzanne created the first bioart laboratory operating within a fine arts department. And I have a laboratory operating in a science department, and that was pretty hard to set up. So imagine setting that up in a fine arts department. At the School of Visual Arts in New York City, where she is currently the chair. And with that, let's give a round of applause to welcome Suzanne Anker to Syracuse and for her presentation today.
Yes. And this, okay, now to go forward, it's this one. Well, thank you all for coming. And thank you all for having a philosophical discourse about this subject. I'm going to talk in very different terms. First of all, as an art practitioner, and second of all, as a former art historian. Before I became chair of the Fine Arts Department at SVA, I was chair of the Art History Department for 5 years, even though I have no degrees in art history. So my appointment was based on the fact that I had a much more empirical kind of teaching method for art history. And I know those of you who are afraid to raise your hand in class, thinking that you might have the wrong answer, art is particularly difficult to value because it's polysemous in nature, which means it can mean more than one thing at one time. It can hold a contradiction, perhaps not unlike Heisenberg, okay? Looking back at art over the last century or so, aesthetics has essentially developed an evil twin, maybe even an alter ego called the anti-aesthetic. So when we look at art, the concept of beauty, although it plays some role, is very different than it was in the 17th or 18th or 19th centuries. So today, we are now confronted as well with AI images. This is the first cover of a fashion magazine, Vogue, that was produced by AI. No models, no cameras, no studios, etc. No photographer. So how do we assess an image like this in a fashion magazine that was made by a machine? Another thing I'm going to mention here is how is beauty redefined based on fashion, on cinema, and on cultural standards? You know, this is not one size fits all as it was in the classical model, which dealt with mathematical kinds of coordinates. So beauty has different standards with different social values in different communities. Also going to talk about what are the social, political, and cultural values of beauty as they have entered into political regimes' discourse. How has beauty been used as a feature towards a more authoritarian rule? And then finally, I'm going to show you some images of my own work, which has been called beautiful by many people. But the backstory of my own work is that I use beauty as a foil, as a way to attract you to an underlying premise which may not be so beautiful, okay? So let's begin. A very standard dictionary definition: beauty, a quality that is present in a thing or a person, giving intense aesthetic pleasure or deep satisfaction to the senses or the mind. A beautiful thing as a work of art, a building, could even be a screwdriver, who knows? A person or thing that excels or is remarkable of its kind. So here is an indication his black eye was a beauty. And although we're using the word beauty to describe something that is really not beautiful, it has to do with, again, these backstories that we cannot see. We have here, a New Yorker cover by Russell Connor, who was the head of the Department of Education at the Whitney Museum. And he was also a painter and known to appropriate images from other paintings' work. But here he creates a cover and these inside stories about fashion that shows sort of the changing standards of beauty. We have on the left part of a portrait of Marie Therese, who is Picasso's, one of Picasso's mistresses. And on the right, we have John Singer Sargent, his portrait of Madame X. And in these compositions that have been appropriated by Connor, he had the women sort of facing one another. And in Picasso's Girl Before a Mirror, we see an aging Marie-Thérèse sort of taking beauty as something that can also deteriorate. And the piece on the right by John Singer Sargent, we see Madame X that he painted over and over again because it was very scandalous. He had originally painted her with one of the straps to her gown hanging down that made her look like she was a woman of false morals, of bad morals. But the other thing about beauty in the 19th century is that there were many parties given by the upper classes in which they would invite the pretty women, and it would say so even on the invitation. It says here, the PBs are coming, meaning professional beauties. So to have a professional beauty at your party was a sign of status. Then comes Marcel Duchamp. And in the 1912 Armory show, he presented Nude Descending a Staircase, and that created another uproar, okay? Not because of any sexuality attached to this, but because it had veered away from standards of beauty one usually considers with the nude. And in some of the cartoons that appeared in the newspaper during this time, he was actually mocked. And one cartoon said, it's the rude descending the staircase or rush hour on the subway. This is a time American art was kind of a backwater, and it was some of the first times at the Armory show that abstract painting and abstract sculpture really were viewed by an American audience. Now, of course, Marcel Duchamp did not stop at that. He essentially changed the ontological nature of a work of art. And this was meant that it's not necessarily a retinal activity. It can be a conceptual activity in which the context or how the object is used that creates meaning. Very similar to the language games of Wittgenstein and how what is in a sentence will determine the meaning of that word. So we all know the word to. We know to, T-O, T-W-O, T-O-O. So when I say that sentence, you know, because of the context, what I mean. So when I see this bottle wrap at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I'm not seeing it in a hardware store. I am assuming that transference of context is what gives it aesthetic value. You know, I have one of these in my loft, and when people come over to visit, they ask me, is that a Marcel Duchamp? And of course I say yes, even though it is not. Now we're going to kind of move over into the aesthetics of scientists, and for many of the scientists here, I know that you have a course in manipulating images or in creating what can be termed beautiful images, but images are not necessarily art, okay? And here we see a photomicrograph of mouse fibroblasts stained with various colored fluorescent probes. I had the honor of visiting Heidi's lab today to watch her students struggle with a Fiji program, which is similar to Photoshop, in order to get their assignment done. So this is a relatively new thing in science, because at one time in science, only pictures that were black and white were allowed to represent scientific imagery because they seem more serious. And now what happens is many scientists vie for the cover of science journals, not necessarily with the best science, but with the best image, okay? And one can say formally, well, here's an image that almost has a parallelogram in the center, and it's outlined with blue dots with a central dot in the middle that's pink. Now, if I look at a Sam Francis painting, I see it has a similar parallelogram in the center, and it has various dabs and dots surrounding that. And the question then arises, when we see them together, what is the difference here? The difference is, although they may share formal attributes of the color, form, etc., the discourse to which they refer is totally different. Whereas the scientific image of this tissue is a data-driven image that will help, perhaps, help scientists understand the nature of cells more evenly, whereas the image on the right is in the tradition of color field painting, in which the outside world is kind of eliminated and the formal elements of art, color, form, space, texture, are those that are autotelic, meaning they refer to themselves. And this keeps on going on. This is not only one example of this. Here we see neurons grown in culture to study the synapses of the brain. There's these linear forms that interact with one another, with part of our consciousness. But at the same time, we see a Jackson Pollock painting called Lavender Mist, and his is a very different set of notations behind this image, because Jackson Pollock was the first artist to separate line from form. That line for him was the exploration of gravity, and how gravity is, and the forces of nature are what create art. And his expression, I am nature, I don't paint nature, I am nature, has to do with this supposition, and hence his fame, as opposed to my 5-year-old could do the same thing. Okay? And again, here we see the comparison, we see the overlap in formal values, totally different stories. Can one talk about an aesthetics of cancer? That's like the black eye. Can a beautiful yet malignant entity be described in aesthetic terms? What moral value would be implicit in such a question? And we see this with very stunning images created by scientists. The one on the left is life itself, and it's day 2 of a 4-cell human embryo, but it's titled Life Itself. Now, this raises a discourse of when life begins, which no one can really put their finger on, even though some theologians, etc., have tried. It also raises questions about reproductive technologies, about women's right to choose, just for its title. Okay? The other image, called Bouquet, is a colony of carcinoma malignant cells. And yes, it's a stunning image, but when we go again to the backstory of carcinoma cells, the person who embodies this cell itself is a horrible situation. So what other terms can we develop when we're looking at these images, which are stunning, but yet have social consequences or even horrific medical issues? There is an artist named Felice Frankel, has written a number of books. Here is Picturing Science and Engineering, and it is a book which is supposed to help scientists with creating better images. And some of the problems with falsifying images is that one may mistake some part of the data for an artifact. And this has been, again, a way to adjust lighting, to adjust composition, to adjust color, etc. So this is very questionable unless there is some sort of caption that says what was done to this image, or in a footnote, or even show the original as well as the doctored image. Now, recently, because of AI, there is this Four Corners project, and it has a website. I advise you to look at it, in which you can put an image in it, and each one of the four corners will tell you more about the context of that image. So here is the backstory, the authorship, links, and related imagery. So it's not about taking something out of context and changing its meaning, as we saw with Marcel Duchamp. Okay, we're coming kind of full circle here, where we're getting the full story. So with AI images, people are very nervous about not being able to separate fact from fiction. Cultural standards of beauty. Very tricky, particularly in today's culture, where standards of beauty have changed greatly. Here we see something from 1904 and 1953. These are pneumatic bust forms. If you've never heard of them, I don't know if they're still in business, but but here they are. When breasts were almost like a commodity, particularly large breasts, as a kind of sex symbol that we saw. Now today, of course, this is very different. And I'm going to read something here from you about more recently. The breast has taken on new meaning in the non-binary community. Breast removal surgery is a current practice. As stated by the Mayo Clinic, top surgery for transgender women and non-binary people might be done as a step in the process of treating discomfort when gender identity differs from sex assigned at birth, called gender dysphoria. So here's an example of the changing role of the breast in culture that is happening today. And of course, in the pow down women, a sign of beauty and a sign of tourist attraction are women who appear to have expanded their neck. They wear coils around their neck, and you can see in the X-ray The vertebrae are extended, but what this also does is it pushes down the shoulders. Now, in visual art, Mondigliani showed women with elongated necks as a sign of beauty. But here, this becomes a cultural ritual that is very painful. And it is something that some women have no choice in actually doing. And here we have Mr. Pearl, who has an 18-inch waist because he wears a corset 24/7. Again, this hourglass figure, which was some sort of idyllic representation in fashion, is represented here. Which brings us to Orlan, who I think was a visiting artist here, who was fascinated by all of the beauties and great history. So she had some plastic surgery mimicking the chin of Botticelli's Venus, the nose of Leon Gérôme's Psyche, the lips of Boucher's Europa, the eyes of Diana, and the forehead of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And here she is on the operating table being marked up. And this is being live broadcast from the operating room into the gallery. I haven't shown all the gruesome pictures. You can look her up yourself. Again, this will go under the phase of body art. We can also say it's bio art. She is using her body as an instrument in her work. She collected all the fat that was taken out of her body, and those could be sold as samples. And here's where things get very tricky. And that is in this book, Art and Race. And this is from 1928. It is by Paul Schultz Namberg, in which he compared the distortions of modern art with physical abnormalities or deformities. And when this was shown, people really believe this, that only a sick society or sick artists would make sick paintings reminiscent of physical sickness. Now, what's wrong with this analogy is that the people who are represented on my right did not choose to be born that way. There was no agency involved in these kinds of deformities. Whereas the piece on the left, which shows Mondigliani and I think it's Otto Dix, no, it's Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. They decided after World War I to express the dystopia in the society. The Dada work of Duchamp, the expressionist work of the German expressionists, the surrealists, all of this now is beginning to be a critique of the rationality leading up to the war. And again, this happens in World War II. And as you can see here, the image on the left is part of the exhibition. Works were shown upside down. They were crowded together. Writing was on the wall. And the piece on the right shows a long line outside of the exhibition. And it was one of the most well-attended exhibitions in the history of art. Now, this idea keeps on resurfacing. We have a person, a poster. If this man had been sterilized panel from Eugenics in New Germany exhibition, which was in California, by the way, part of the whole eugenics interest in building better babies and hygiene. It says here, you know, if this man had been sterilized, you would not get all of these different people. Like it would not have 4 deaf and dumb, 3 stutterers, 2 epileptics, etc. And being Black at this time was considered a deformity. In 2000, Mark Quinn, who you may know as one of the young British artists, got a commission in London for the 4th plinth. The plinths are usually used for heroes. And he got the commission and he did this statue of Alison Lapper and Paris. Alison Lapper was one of the thalidomide babies. In the 1960s, a drug called thalidomide was used as a kind of a Valium to calm down pregnant women. And many of the babies born during that period had distorted limbs, okay? And then no one heard from them again. They were hidden away. Mark Quinn decided to do this portrait to Alison Lapper in giant size sculpture, outdoor sculpture, which caused an uproar. And it caused an uproar because white marble was used on a deformed body. White marble goes back to the classical statues like David, and the disc thrower from the Roman and Greek periods, and was about the immortality of beauty. And here we see someone whose body is irregular for standards of beauty getting that presentation, where everyone has to look at this and uncover the secret past. The other thing about it is she was an unwed mother. And there were back and forths online about how this could be presented. So this is very recent about these notions of what's appropriate and not. Also, there were better baby contests in America. Here's 1923. And babies were graded by the time they were either from 6 months old to, preteens, et cetera, the same way you would look at a dog show, okay? The size of the nose, the quality of the teeth, the height, the fat content, all of these qualities that you'd have in dogs or cattle. And it's no coincidence that all of these babies are white. And here, some last minute photos. The prettiest babies, they're all white. So here you can see the intrinsic racism that a picture tells. And this is happening at the same time that industrial design is having a heyday. And the idea of industrial design is to streamline. If you remember the old cars, when they first came out, they were very box-like. They are getting more streamlined till today, which they're very streamlined. So industrial design, which is about the efficiency and sleekness of objects, was also applied through eugenics to bodies. Okay, now I'm going to show you a few of my works here. which again, this is about beauty acting as a foil. These are from the Everson Museum of Art, where I had an exhibition in 2019. And these are all porcelain handmade sculptures. And looking at them, one could say they're very beautiful. On the other hand, they represent the deadening of coral reefs worldwide. That coral reefs are under siege by toxicity and by misappropriation of funds. And although one looks at this and gets some idea of the beauty involved in nature's forms, at the same time, it's a representation of a devastating effect. And here you can see a single piece. Each one is unique. Each one is from a specimen of sea sponge, actually, which we can relate to genetically. We're about 70% identical to. Okay, here was one of the major rooms in the exhibition here, which had 48, 44 by 44 inch prints. And in the giant case in front of it, it had the equivalent of those prints as rapid prototype sculptures. And we'll come in and take a look further here. You can kind of see the scale of this. And people had a very good time trying to match up the two-dimensional image with the three-dimensional image, because it changes your perspective on looking. And this is what Heidi said in her class today as she asked her students to create volume. Okay? These are called vanitas in a Petri dish, and what they generally do is bring together items of nature with items from culture, or mix and match between animals and vegetables. They're a statement about synthetic technology in which you can put, fish genes in a tomato. These were recently shown, 75 of these were recently shown in the Beijing Biennial, which was called Synthetic Ecology. So as we now move towards depletion of the natural, we live in this world that is a spectrum between the cultural and the natural. And where we are on the scale is up for grabs. So here you can see this very clearly, a rubber ducky next to a sunflower, or a zinnia that is next to a piece of ceramic. All sorts of companies are now coming up with different ways to make synthetic foods, whether they be shrimp or eggs, or burgers, etc. And again, the attraction here is to make the audience look at this work. And then they start to find some correlations, because industrial products use the same color that we find in the natural world. Here is a shrimp and some glass, and a piece of meat, and a flower that is a cutout. Just really starting to talk about the backstories of all the items in this set. And with developing a third axis, you can see that a still life can be turned into a landscape by creating the z-axis. And what's interesting about this is they're both art historical genres. So in bioart, it's not enough to put a few pieces of biology in there. You also need to answer to art history. And a bigger version from the Everson, a close-up in which you can see the glassware acting as lenses, distorting the images of what's behind. And here we see this kind of magical landscape that is made out of some living material as well as a cookie. And I'm going to end with this series, which is the current series I'm working on, that I started during COVID when we all had to leave our seats in school and sit in front of a computer, okay? I happen to be very lucky in the sense that I have a house outside of New York City, and my family all went to stay in this house that has a 2-acre surround. And what I decided to do is do a series of work called After Eden, in which I would now start combining things in the garden that existed and didn't exist. So, for example, would we be able to get a fern, something like these cutout forms intersecting in the center of the picture? It's kind of an imaginary form, but as we talked about the imagination, that it also is about how we create new life forms. If you've never heard of the term biofact, biofact is a man-made entity that is part artifact and part biology. It was coined by Nicholas Karaphelis, a German philosopher in Europe, and it's not easy to coin terms in German, okay? And she was able to do that because we have Oncomouse, who was born in a laboratory. We have a whole set of genetically modified organisms, from the food we eat to the clothes we wear, to the medicines we take, etc. So this is bringing together this idea of manipulation of life forms. Another one here is the intersection of different species from different climates. So you never would see a tropical climate, and this has a very tropical feel, with a fir tree in it. And everything in these photographs I grew. So that was the caveat, that it had to be something that I actually tended to. And then as I went further, and I'm still working on this series, I made about 80 of these pieces. I decided that every day when I wake up, I don't know what I'm going to wear because it's a different season. And we've all experienced that. Yesterday it was 63 degrees. Today I'm wearing my down back jacket. So I've took some summer flowers and put them in a snowstorm. And again here, and I call these mono seasons, in which all seasons happen at the same time. And I think this one tells you very clearly that we can have snow and summer at simultaneous times in our changing climate, and that we have to wake up to that. So in conclusion, I just want to go over a couple of statements here that representations and their meanings are complex relationships, and they change over time and context. How do we attribute the reliability of truth to an image, particularly in the age of AI? Do images produce knowledge? In what way? They're polysemous. Can images lie? Well, of course they can. How will AI change our perception? We don't know. Do we agree with the New York Times that our warming planet is a petri dish? And how can we aid in the reparation of the planet? Now, the petri dish is a cultural icon. It represents that which is yet to emerge. It is not just a piece of laboratory apparatus. So with those conclusions, I'll speak to you later.
So we're going to have just a 5-minute break. Just use the washroom if you need to quickly, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Please stay for the Q&A. We want to hear your thoughts and questions. So just a very quick 5-minute break.
Have their ideas like playing powerfully. I was feeling like, you guys gave these presentations. It's just so weird to see the evolution, It's here. I know, right? So you can
yes, it's over there. Thursday. Yeah.
Thursday. Okay, but I did it. Okay, all right.
Thank you. Yeah, I was here for I believe the past 3 days. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there'll be like little food breaks and stuff too, at 5 to 6 across the street. Yeah. So you should come by and get some food. Yeah. Are you staying for the rest of the day? Yeah. Even if you're near Shakers, there's free food from 5 to 6 breaks over on the inside. Yeah.
They got a class meeting, so in a year, on time, so it's actually.
So. Go ahead.
Well, also like I can't
It tells you.
Yeah, because
I mean, the overall food.
what I like is when you're holding Ankers. And then they look up.
Yeah.
Hard spinning. But yeah.
But I'll let you know. Maybe that is Sarah Franklin got a big grant and had this big conference where she had, anthropologists, veterinarians, scientists, a couple of artists. Theorists, lots of different things. So she was,
Yes, I'm planning an which is also
there's a lot to choose from.
Four of us here.
Didn't snow. This winter.
Are you okay with this?
I didn't know I was so thirsty.
Okay, so I think we can start again with a few questions. Maybe Heidi and I will start with a few questions to get the discussion going, and then we'd be very happy to hear questions from the audience. Maybe I can start with a question. Yeah. So one thing that really struck me as I was hearing both of your talks is that each of you were speaking about conceptions of beauty in different historical periods. So Angela in 18th century, Suzanne in 19th, 20th century, although some of the scientific experiences of beauty were from more recent. And it's interesting that in the Kantian picture, the experience of beauty is one where we have some sense of, how the imagination and the experience of beauty is giving us some hint of our, capacity to understand the world and to sort of unify different phenomena, and to sort of be able to expand our capacities. And I was, again, sort of struck that with a lot of the images that Suzanne was talking about, it's almost as if the experiences of beauty are experiences of, kind of alien experiences, right? For example, the marble where you find it beautiful, but then you notice that it's deformed limbs, or the elongated necks, but then you realize, that what the sort of health consequences are of that, or the coral reefs, but then what that means. And so I'm just kind of curious, what each of you would say about the other's overall sort of conception of beauty. So for example, in your case, Angela, do you think that the Kantian conception of beauty presupposes, sort of this view of our being able to kind of unify different phenomena in a way that makes us feel sort of at home in the world, and that perhaps it's more difficult to sustain that conception of, a relationship to the world? Or do you think that, no, that's still, possible and important to sort of defend that conception of beauty? So for example, I know that a lot of artists feel kind of pressure not to do art that is beautiful in the sort of traditional way. A lot of artists want to do more representational, beautiful, traditionally beautiful work, and they feel sort of pressured not to do that. But I think also there are a lot of artists who feel very uncomfortable with that, and want to sort of defend this more traditional conception of beauty. And so I just, I'm kind of curious what you think about that, and likewise with Suzanne. Do you think that on the flip side of that, right, that one might feel troubled by the way in which art is sort of used for political purposes exclusively, or social purposes, or forms of kind of critique, and that it might seem like there is no space, for in art now for art that it's beautiful in the more traditional sense and not tied to any art for art's sake, I guess. So I'm just curious what both of you would think about that.
Thank you. Should I start? Or
I think so. I think you have your own mic.
I took my mic off. Sorry,
Oh,
I thought I
okay.
was done.
That's
with my
fine.
mic.
That's fine.
So thank you for the question. There are a couple of things I want to say. So one is that I think we can take from the Kantian picture a more general insight if we understand beauty broadly as a positive aesthetic experience. And I don't think that has to be sort of beauty in any, according to any standards, say, I don't know, the 18th century standards of beauty, or the 19th or the 20th, but that just refers us to a positive aesthetic experience, where I think that aesthetic experience can involve a lot more aesthetic qualities. So I think beauty is a sort of general, well, that's how I would want to read it, a general term for a positive aesthetic experience. And then we can perhaps specify and give more specialized aesthetic terms to the kind of experience we're describing by a beautiful experience. And if that's how what we understand by beauty, we can also account for experiences that are not according to the standard, but that may include works that are not sort of beautiful in the standard way, but that still give us an experience that is meaningful to us, and that may sort of transport us into a different realm in the imagination. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing, in response to your question, is that I think it's possible to see a beautiful artwork that nevertheless refers to some jarring fact in the world. And I'd be interested to hear what Suzanne thinks about that. You mentioned some thoughts along those lines, where the beautiful is somehow at odds with the terrible fact that is being represented, like climate change, for instance. I don't think there's anything so intrinsically incoherent about that idea. So it doesn't, there may still be a moment of sort of unifying our understanding of what's going on there, but it's not, the beauty doesn't have to refer to anything harmonious in the world, I would say. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, it's.
Just
Go ahead.
add or clarify just briefly that I just wanted to clarify that what I meant by sort of traditional conception of beauty, I didn't mean any sort of particular standard of beauty, but more the idea that experiences of beauty are positive experiences, as you said. No, and it seems like in a lot of the experiences that Suzanne was describing, I think that's what I was having in mind when I described as alien experiences, is exactly what you said. No, an experience where you, on the one hand, see that something is beautiful, perhaps in this positive sense, but also then are horrified by what it's representing.
Yeah, well, I'm on mic here. I think it's very complicated because I think my colleague is talking about beauty as an experience, and I'm talking about beauty as a tool. I'm talking about the utility of beauty and the way it can be manipulated, including in my own work, which I use it as a foil, okay? I don't think anyone would want to look at my work if it was just a bunch of broken plaster shards, okay? I also think this goes back to the question of art, maybe even with the Frankfurt School, with Adorno and Marcuse, in what the function of art is, whether it's a thing in and of itself and has no other ends to it, or whether it is sort of an agent of social change. And there's been lots of discussions about this. As far as contemporary artists being dissuaded from making beautiful objects or images, I think that that is true, because sometimes these beautiful objects or images really represent kitsch. They have the answer already embedded in them, so that they do not ask the viewer to evaluate what's going on, that the response is already generated, like in advertising, okay? And I think that in our daily life, when we look at the sky and we see some beautiful oranges and pinks, that's pollution, okay? So this question of signified and signifier is that, you know, if we apply that to beauty, how do we parse that? And I think that artistic practice has its own history, which it refers to. And then therefore, I think that it is an open code, that you make something, it redefines the code. You make something else, it redefines it again. Right now, this is a very dystopian time in the world, and the early 20th century was very dystopian. And that's when art turned towards dystopia as a reflection of the culture. And, you know, art is also a reflection of patronage systems, and many things that sell for exorbitant prices are neither aesthetic nor anti-aesthetic. They're just junk, okay? You could have junk science, you could have junk art, you could probably have junk philosophy too, okay? So I think it's really where the criticality lies, and how you want to frame the subject, which philosophers are very good at doing, very good at doing. I think that our job as artists is to create sets of images that essentially open possibilities.
Oh boy. So I was really intrigued by the whole Heisenberg discussion, and how when he had almost an epiphany on his science, he felt it was beautiful, right? And so, but I wonder if in that context he ever considered the audience, the scientific audience, and if that contributed to those feelings of epiphany. And then, because I think I sort of relate to what Suzanne was saying, when I do science, I think sometimes I tend to use beauty as a tool. We try to make a figure beautiful and simple and easy to digest, because the discovery in itself is what we want to portray. It's almost selling the discovery. And I think when I have those moments of epiphany or a discovery, I don't think about the audience in those moments that's going to also view it at some point. And so I'm wondering, I guess where I want to lead this to is, where in those contexts do you think leads to creativity? And does it lead to a different form of creativity? Is it like there's like a marketing type of creativity, or is there a true creativity? And where does each aspect contribute to? I don't care who answers it, but sort of a general.
So I think that's an interesting question. Do you mean, are you distinguishing between a creativity in the science and coming up with the ideas, and then also one in the sort of presentation of the ideas?
Yeah, because I guess like even with the dance in the beginning, right? And whoever conceptualized that dance, they're conceptualizing it as the viewpoint of an audience, right? To perceive it. I'm thinking, when I'm conceptualizing a scientific question for the process of a discovery, I don't think about an audience, right? I only think about an audience after the fact. But is that consideration help shape your own question you ask? And should it? Like maybe I should be thinking about the audience to help me shape my question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, there are a few thoughts. I mean, one is that I'm not sure if every artist necessarily thinks about the audience in the creation of their work. In Pina Bausch's case, for instance, I mean, I think that her taking the position of the audience is doing an additional thing to her creating the dance. So I think that, I mean, I would want to distinguish between the two moments, even in the case of art. Although, I don't know, maybe there are cases where the two are necessarily tied together, where you can't sort of divest the art, the production of the artwork from the audience's perspective. So when I talked about the audience, that was more in relation to the experience of beauty rather than the sort of the question of what the artwork is. That's a thought about art, but then in the case of Heisenberg or the scientist more generally, I think you have to at least consider the other scientists and science students, insofar as you want to make your science understandable, right? It's not just for you, it's you're contributing to a discussion, and in that sense at least the audience has to be in the picture. I mean, it's not the audience in the sense of someone sitting in the auditorium maybe, but it's the scientific community in more general terms that you have to answer to. I mean, you're going to have to defend your proposal to others. So so I think, I mean, even if it's a second step, it comes pretty early on, I think. The thought of the others and how best you present your work to them in order to defend it, make it plausible, and so on. So maybe maybe there isn't such a great difference between art and science in that respect.
I think in some ways you're talking about that aha moment where the pieces fit together and there's real joy at that point. Even in art, moving a color over to another part of the painting or whatever changes the whole gestalt and how you experience it. And when something's off and when it's not. And, in science, they talk about the elegance of an equation, and they don't have any problem with the elegant. But I think that art is so amorphous at this point that it has become almost a total commodity, that it becomes less anthropological and idea-driven than it has its value on a market.
I have more questions, but maybe we can first open it up to the audience and see if anybody has a question that you would like to ask. You can pass with the mic. Oh, yeah.
This has been a very interesting afternoon, I have to say, and I I'm going to pose sort of two general questions, thinking about the two presentations, because I think there's wonderful overlap occurring. I'm very interested in this idea of the artist and the audience sharing a space, and that using this kind of idea of the imagination as this kind of hydraulic cognitive ability that people have to find commonness and ground. Whereas we could argue that the environment itself, whether we think of it strictly as a natural environment or we think of it as a social economic environment, the commonality of the environment is really the cohesive force besides the imagination. And the environment, as far as I know, does not have a manifestation of an imagination, which I find interesting. There's been attempts, but that's the first thing is that my question would be, in the case of that idea of using an imagination to unify or form common notions at the moment of what is beautiful against all the changing things that we talked about. Is it important to imagine the imagination of the environment, right, in terms of that equation? So that's the first question. The second question is it came up when Heidi kind of blatantly took the lead on this idea of beauty as a tool, right, and that implication that was said about scientists using beautiful color photographs of aspects of nature that get them published rather than the truth of their thing. But the idea of the beauty as a tool, which was alluded to, and I went to the Everson show, Suzanne show, and the objects were beautiful. But I in no way read that as an act of deceit, which I think in a way it is, because if it's ironic and we have to look at the artificiality and the irony of the statement, you know, she should really hit everybody over the head that looks at it and says, look, I'm deceiving you. I'm deceiving you. And so I'm wondering what the ethics are relative to that. And I'm just kind of curious about that. I think this idea of beauty as a tool or as a form of seduction or whatever, it seems like we're into some pretty rich territory here in terms of deceit. And what is the role of deceit in all of our forms of communication? Because there's a lot of deceit around. And of course, that aspect of the beauty as a tool, I think we've heard of advertising, you know, and it's very toxic situation. It's destroyed our languages to a large degree. And so I think you're really on it's a dangerous thing you're working on. So it's just to me, there was a certain clarity in your presentation of a kind of the work is kinky, you know, and a lot of art over time has been kinky. You know, like Duchamp was the master of kink. You know, and I'm just saying, I find that deception part interesting. So those are my general questions.
Okay.
It was in there.
What's the role of deceit?
Okay, well, let's go back to why did Plato ban lawyers and poets from the Republic? Art is a lie. Let's begin that. I mean, if I'm going to quote Picasso, art is a lie that tells the truth. So because it is both emotional and cognitive simultaneously and at once, it is operating on both sides of the coin. And the question about audience is not a singular term. You bring with the performance or the artwork your own biases, values, experience, etc. And where some audiences would prefer a bucolic scene of a landscape, other audiences would rather not see that because it's a lie, okay? So I think this is a good question about deceit and how it operates, and maybe the philosophers could this becomes a Jesuitical question too. Does deceit have value, have beneficial value? And I think art, which is a form of deceit, particularly painting with its illusions, has great value. It is the data bank of consciousness throughout time.
Shall I respond to the first question?
Or-
I'm not entirely sure I understood the first question correctly, so I'm just going to say a few things, and if I'm besides the point, let me know. So you asked about whether the environment has an imagination, and I take that to be a question that comes out of the suggestion that the audience's imagination is involved in the experience of the artwork. I think the environment is important for what the artwork is. Suzanne talked about the ontological change in an object once you place it in a different environment. But I wouldn't speak of the imagination of the environment, but rather the sort of imaginative associations with the environment that the audience has. That's important in sort of reflecting on the artwork. Does that make sense? I mean, so it's not that the environment has an imagination. It's rather that we imagine certain things about the environment that are then relevant for our understanding or for our appreciation of the artwork. Does that answer your question, or were you going somewhere else with it?
No, I think what I was just fascinated with was the idea of. I think you made some really brilliant points about the interpretation of that dance work, that the work is an aesthetic object which is created by this choreographer, and it's executed beautifully, and the audience for that work, it could be including the choreographer, the audience has an imagination that fills in the differences between what the aesthetic construction is and what it is that they can relate to, right? So I love that idea of that kind of dialogue of imaginations. But ultimately, the common experience of being there is being in an environment, which is also a construct for us because we're not part of nature, we're not part of the dance history, we're outside. And so I'm just trying to imagine an entity like the environment itself having a flexible language structure that would change at the moment, right? And if that would be important towards understanding why that moment is beautiful, if we had the ability of cognitively of imagining what the environment's imagination was like. That's what I'm. And the backdrop for that is all these societal things. It drives me crazy. I was raised an American. I sat in all those theaters and I watched Disney construct my imagination. Right? Our imaginations are collectively formed, whether it's stories that our parents read to us, whatever, and the limitations obviously between an artist's imagination and the limitations of the general society. That's mostly what artistic dialogue is about, so I'm just anyways, for me that's what you stimulated, was this question: does the environment itself in its common form have an imagination, and should that be something that people are figuring into this dialogue of imagination?
I think that is taking an anthropomorphic attitude. And these are sort of the same kind of questions. When does life begin? I think also that in Pina Bausch, who I have great respect for and love her work, everyone may not like it. Everyone would say, well, they don't have any tutus here, okay? That what happened to literal ballet? Why do I have to see people getting all wet? What's so aesthetic about that? So I think there are degrees of difference in interpretation that different audiences have based on many social issues that define taste.
So is there any else? I'm going to bring up a touchy question that I know I talk to as scientists all the time in my
I wonder though,
building.
I
Yeah.
wanted to piggyback on something of the dialogue of imaginations, if that's okay. And then I can, yeah. Okay. So was the question that I had, another question that I was thinking about relates to this idea that in aesthetic experience, there's a kind of dialogue of imaginations. And I was wondering, how that might help us think about the educational value of aesthetic experience. So let me expand on that. So as you know, and as many philosophers know, there are certain philosophers who think that they need to kind of write in a certain style, perhaps specifically a kind of literary style, to convey a particular philosophical point. And the idea there is that, the point that you're trying to convey is one that, philosophy requires a kind of commitment on the part of the reader, that without that kind of commitment, you won't be able to understand a certain philosophical argument. Of course, not all philosophers think that. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if we can think of that, idea of like why certain philosophers think that they need to write in a certain kind of perhaps more literary or beautiful form. If the point there is to say like, well, if in order to really educate another person, I need to, stimulate their kind of active involvement and the active involvement of their imagination, right? I can't really educate them if I just sort of dump the information onto them. But I need to educate them in a certain way that sort of sparks their imaginative activity. And so then I can kind of like provide all the information, but need to leave certain things, a little bit obliquely said or hint at them so that they feel like their imagination, they're kind of actively involved in the production of knowledge in some sense. I guess that's a question for both of you. How thinking about this active involvement on the part of the person viewing the aesthetic object has something to do with the way that beauty can educate.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I'm really interested in what Suzanne means by the suggestion that beauty is a tool or I think you also said it's a foil. I can see how there's a dialogue with art history. You're sort of using beauty in your art because that is what we find in the history of art, but then you're doing something else with it. So it's perhaps beauty on the surface, but underneath something else is going on. But I would like to know whether you think, sorry to add to the question, but whether you think that whether you would agree with a presentation of your work as really being about the message, the underlying message, and the beauty being only a sort of education or a means to or a hook to draw the audience in. Is that correct, or would you say?
I think it is. Well, I enjoy making beautiful objects, but I'm making beautiful objects about not so beautiful situations, and I think that's what I've done this before. Also, I've done it with reproductive technologies, in which I've created large-scale fetuses that hang on the wall, and one critic reviewed it as trophies. And when you sort of looked at the whole arrangement, this piece was actually about the origin of life, going back to some theories about ancient RNA. And but people, because they saw rapid prototype fetus structures, some of them were horrified. Okay, so a piece was beautiful, but the idea of sort of the unknown theories about the origin of life is what had interested me to make the work.
Can I maybe just say one more thing? I think response to your question, that seems to me, I mean, that's one particularly striking maybe instance of the more general phenomenon you described, that maybe we can use beauty to draw the attention to some underlying message,
Yeah.
or the message may be about something horrible, but it could also just be about, I don't know, a philosophical thesis and the best argument for it.
Yeah,
Whether
but I think the model or the sort of education that is going on in the way that you're thinking about art is very different, because in Suzanne's case, it seems like you're trying to hook somebody's imagination, then to tell them a specific determinate content that's already worked out. Whereas in your case, it seems like you're, educating in the sense that you're trying to bring the person in, but you don't have any sort of particular message that you're trying to tell them. It's more like, I want to sort of bring you into this active, engaged mental space where maybe we can find something out together, but you don't have any particular message that you're trying to give them. No, so I think that is a very important and interesting difference between these two conceptions of beauty.
I think there is some openness, but I wouldn't say that. So, for instance, in the case of Bausch, I wouldn't say that it's all open.
Yeah.
So I think there are some ideas that are suitable and others that aren't.
Sure.
And so there's space for the imagination to make something out of the ideas.
Yeah.
But I think if we thought of the dance as representing, I don't know, a school class going on a trip to Mallorca, then I would say those ideas are unsuitable to make
Or
sense of it.
unsuitable.
Unsuitable.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that there is something that the choreographer wants to get across.
No, of course, yeah. All that I meant was that there isn't a particular message that Pina Bausch is trying to have you get away, go away with. There's a kind of openness to the range of possible interpretations. Whereas in Suzanne's case, it seems like you are trying to convey something quite specific.
Well, sometimes,
Yeah.
but sometimes not. And I think, again, the interpretations will lie somewhere between the artist's intent and the audience's reception. And that bridge is not always clear.
Okay, my turn. So I want to get back to something I think we talk about a lot, at least in the science department, and Tom touched on it, and also something that you touched on, where you said a lie to tell the truth, or something like that. And you were saying like it's deceitful. I think you used the word to like present beauty to like pull somebody in. And so I think one of the things that I've always been, I don't know. I can't think of the word, but one thing he brings up a lot is like, why did you choose those colors in your images? And it brings up that point that you said about science was always presented in black and white. And now we pseudo-color our images. Our pictures are taken in black and white, and we pseudo-color them a color to try to depict a story. And is that deceitful in what we do? But now there's this whole thing that you opened your talk up with AI. And is it that AI is deceitful, or is it that maybe we can use AI in a way with our writing that we always talk about as a lie to tell the truth, to tell a better truth? And is it something we should or shouldn't be scared of? Is it in parallel in the same way as those black and white photos where we didn't use color? Is it the same thing? Or is there considerations to be had about what tools we use to convey truth and beauty? Do you need it? Do you want double?
Oh, I don't need a double mic. Well, I think, beauty has always been associated with the good. And so there's a moral value right there. And as opposed to an action. And where his idea of deceit comes in. And is beauty truth? And again, what is beauty? Is it the aha moment?
Maybe I'll just say one very small thing in response to what you said. In thinking about different conceptions of beauty in the history of philosophy, I was trying to think, for example, how Kant's conception of beauty might relate to Plato's conception of beauty that, in a sense, you referred to. And it's interesting that in the Symposium, I think is what you were referring to, where he makes a connection between beauty and the good. Part of the idea there is that we mortals can't possess the good forever, and so the way that we try to possess the good is by creating good things in the presence of beauty. And so beautiful things are things that spark this sort of desire to create in the presence of something beautiful. And I think there's a kind of similarity there with the Kantian idea, right? That beauty is something that sort of sparks a kind of desire to create and brings forth.
It's also a rarity. Beauty is rare, and anything rare is precious. There's
Any questions from the audience?
Thank you, Angela, Suzanne, for your great presentations. Karen, Heidi, for moderating my questions. First to Suzanne, your claim that beauty is a tool. It suggests that beauty cannot or does not exist if not useful for humanity, for humans. And that assumes that that nature is subjugated to the needs of humans, that everything is subjugated to human life. And that is a particular philosophical understanding of nature that I think other people may not subscribe to. So I wonder if you could comment on that, but it relates to my comment for Angela, which is when you claim that beauty is understood through imagination. I think my comment or question relates to what the young man, Tom, was talking about. How about experiences? Because my experience and thus my understanding of the dance could be very different based on what I have experienced in relationships, for example, or my understanding of the bouquet would be different if I know someone who has experienced cancer. So I guess the suggestion that how we understand beauty is based on imagination and that we have these core understandings sort of leaves out the experiences of other kinds of people. And another point is that, Suzanne, you just associated beauty with good and sort of as a moral value, but I guess who's good and whose moral values are you talking about? And if we can move the conversation beyond like Western philosophical ways of thinking about Kant and Plato, and like, what do other people have to contribute to this discussion beyond like the Western philosophical imagination?
Well, I think that's a very complicated question. Beauty is not one thing either. It's multiple things, and also it also depends on how it's used. Okay, now for Charles Darwin, for example, he wrote about wondrous and beautiful things when he was talking about the natural world, and he found beauty in it, and maybe he also found a connection with his imagination with regard to biophilia, because this was about living forms, which are a great mystery and a marvel. But the way beauty has been employed over time has also created propaganda, social injustice, gender discrimination, and a host of other things. And beauty is an industry as well, and it's something that needs to be contextualized without social values.
Yeah, I thought that was, you touched on some really important ideas. I perhaps to add to that, I think that this idea of beauty as sort of a norm or an ambition is interesting. That it's not. I mean, there are. If we look at the world and if we describe what people call beautiful, there are, as a matter of fact, certain standards, and those standards vary between different societies and times. You looked at different standards of beauty in some of the images you showed. Whereas if we think of beauty as a positive aesthetic ideal, we might think that what we're after is something that we could all somehow take part in. I mean, what we're after is an ideal that we could all share. I mean, I think this is a Kantian idea that it leaves open what the particular reflections are of the individual, so the particular imaginative reflections that we might be engaged in looking at a beautiful object. But it's after this sort of ideal value that maybe we haven't got. Who knows whether we've ever made a proper aesthetic judgment. We might have been sort of thinking we've talked about beauty when really we're after something that we're just sort of particular, that we have a particular interest in, that we're sort of that we're pushed to call beautiful because we were raised in a certain way. But if we think of beauty as the sort of ideal that is one that we as humans share, it shouldn't leave out anyone's viewpoint. Anyway, I like that more ambitious kind of conception of beauty as an idea rather than a standard that belongs to a particular group of people at a particular point in time.
Right. Is there any more questions from the audience?
I have one question. But if nobody in the audience has a question first, I think I would prefer to have a question from the audience, but while people are thinking, or yeah, sure.
So I guess this question is primarily aimed at Angela, but Suzanne, given what you said about the polysemous nature of art, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say as well. It occurs to me that there's a kind of asymmetry between imagination in science and in the arts. So I guess because art is, I suppose, partly a collaborative endeavor between the artist and the audience, there's going to be a range of possible ways of unifying and understanding the art. Whereas in science, it seems like there's just one authoritative way of unifying that's given by nature itself. And so it seems like there are more ways of misunderstanding in science than there are in art. So I guess, given that understanding is something about unification, I wonder what other conditions have to be met, given that there are ways we can incorrectly unify the elements of science and art. What beyond unification has to be met? And does that differ in the case of science and in the case of art?
Thank you. So you're asking about the relationship of understanding and truth, I guess, and whether and the worry is that maybe in art what we understand is more open. We can come to understand maybe social phenomena, or we can have insights about our values. Maybe art has more to do with considerations of ethical facts. I don't know. Maybe that's where there's more openness in our understanding. Whereas in science, at least if we're looking at the natural sciences, we're after explaining the facts, and in the end, we have to answer nature, not just some conception of what the facts are. So what more is required? I think, I mean, understanding in the way I've talked about it as unifying different conceptions, then also has to be answerable to the facts. So we have, so if understanding is just the subjective conception of unifying our ideas and seeing what the implications of the ideas are, or what a higher order unifying conception is that makes sense of a different variety of ideas, then we also need to link that conception to the facts. And that's going to be an empirical endeavor, right? We'll have to check whether our unifying principle actually fits with the phenomena. So we have to test the ideas, the unifying ideas against the phenomena. That's required, but it seems to me that the difference to art. So I don't want to say art is science. I agree, it has different aims. It can, or at least it can have different aims. But I think that there is some parallel, because I mean, I don't think, Suzanne, you would want to say that any interpretation of climate change is on the table in your, or I mean, there are some facts that you try to get across and alert us to, I take it. Or if we think about the dance, there are also some social facts or some emotional facts that we're trying to get a better handle on, where we can be right or wrong about them. So I think truth is also, it's not off the table in the arts either. So in any case, I think that the connection with truth is what we need to get from understanding to knowledge. But I wouldn't want to draw an in-principle distinction between art and science in that respect. So yeah, there's truth also in art, I think. But I'd be interested to hear what you...
Well, I think both art and science and philosophy, and probably everything else, asks the question, what if? And I think that kind of what if, and we try this, we try that, we try this, we try that, and eventually something works. And in science, you might be able to repeat it, but in art, you can't, okay? There's no such thing as a copy, even in art. So that art shares the kind of uniqueness of the human spirit, whereas in science, there is a methodology developed to create or prove a certain result. And even if we go back to Leo Steinberg, the Leonardo historian, he says art and science can never be mixed, because he felt that if Leonardo didn't discover what he discovered, someone else would come along and discover that, whereas Leonardo's paintings are only made by Leonardo.
I thought that was an interesting point, that the sort of uniqueness or originality of the artist's perspective and their approach to the work.
Yeah.
I mean, one other point I just wanted to add to my response to Sean was that, I mean, the aims of art may be others from those of science, in so far as, I mean, art may be after similar things like representing the world and getting to the truth about certain facts, but it may also be after, I don't know, changing the world. So after what ought to be rather than what is. And maybe that is an important difference that sort of adds another dimension to art that is not found in science, at least not in the sort of fundamental sciences. But yeah, maybe.
You made me think a little bit because when you were saying that, because there's methodologies, right? Camillo Golgi developed the Golgi stain, and it allowed him to see neurons and intracellular structures. But he never made the discoveries that Cajal made, who used his stain to find all those neurons and how they connect and the interfaces of it. So it took the creativity of Cajal to use the techniques of Golgi.
There you go.
So I do think there's some parallels to think about that is really interesting in that. Like, yes, we have methodology. Yes, we can repeat it, but it's still the eye of the beholder with the method and how we interpret it and go from there. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think about that and that relationship.
It is. Actually, I just remembered, I didn't show you any pictures of my bio art lab. So maybe if we have a minute, I'll just go back
Could I
up
just
here.
ask one quick question
Sure.
before we do that, and then we'll close.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know
If anybody
we've
wants to go.
4:40 and I know we're 5 minutes over, so
Okay.
this will be the resolution and
And then we'll just
Thank
close.
you.
Okay. So both of you have thought a lot about beauty. I wonder if you've thought about ugliness. And so, I wonder, for example, Angela, and I also want to hear Suzanne, what you think. I wonder if, for example, you would say, well, the ugly is that which bores us, which sort of, instead of drawing us out to engage imaginatively with something, just bores us, doesn't really call forth anything. Or how you would describe,
I don't
ugly.
think ugliness bores us. I think, if we think of the grotesque and the carnivalesque, they entertain us with their ugliness. So that's a whole other panel discussion.
Maybe next year.
Maybe next year. Let me just show these two slides. I'm not going to talk. I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures. And if this still works, I don't know. Here we go. Okay, this is my bio art lab, and it's a combination of a 19th century and 21st century laboratory. We have animals and plants. We do molecular cloning of plants, and we work with sustainable materials. And here you can see another view of it. So if anyone is in New York City and wants to come visit, please let me know and I'll give you a better tour. Okay?
Remember that.
guests, our international guest and our other guests. Oh, you don't have to move. It's okay. It's here. I am not mic'd, so yes, no, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's hard to synthesize this, and you can feel the energy of so many, I don't know, atoms or waves. But I just quickly was thinking, one thematic thing for me is everything originating in wonder.
Yes. Yes.
And wonder requiring presence and us being present. And people talk about the art of being present and living in our bodies, as well as our heads. And I like the synthesis here of that. And then I was just also thinking that really human interaction, biological interaction, technological interaction is a conversation like we had today. And there's almost a role of which idea, is sort of an entity. So I like that today too. But, I was also thinking, and I think you both touched on this, I touch, I feel, I witness, I watch, I imagine, I experience. So once again, we think of disciplines as separate, but they're not when we think of us as a being in those processes. So, but the cancer cell and this idea of life, a cancer is a life that exists within my life, and that idea of subjugation. Nature came before us, but I think when we say life, we assume human life. So I think, all of this sparks such important information to today. It also requires an other. It requires a definition, a person defining our meanings of beauty, of philosophy, of thought. So I think that's important to remember too. Every single thing we talked about today involves a definer and a person or something that provides a societal construct or meaning. I think that is very meaningful today as we merge academia with action.
Great.
So, okay, so that's really it. I love Rumi, and what resonates for me is wherever you stand, be the soul of that place. And I just thank you all for being the souls of where you stand. And thank everyone here for being, the souls of this place. And I thank our ancestors and our future generations who are incredibly important people to remember while we're in this room. So thank you for coming. We have food and we have tables set up and everything for more smaller conversations right across the way. If you leave and go that way, there's this Syracuse University Art Museum. So you just go down a flight of stairs or two and across the way through construction and straight across, and you'll share a space, share conversation. So
Great.
Good evening and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's a great your mind and how you're able to piece together like certain things, just like piecing together like art and all that is very, very impressive. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, because it's a touchy subject.
It is.
And there are reasons why the anti-aesthetic.
It's true. No, it is true. As you were saying, I would love to talk more later at a point. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you did so great. I will ship these. Can you just cut it for yes, right there. Like the steps are on the left. The door that's the brown door. The machine is upstairs. There's no.